Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting and to another edition of the Most Disturbing Disappearances. If you imagine the worst place to ever disappear after enduring the most horrific end, you'd likely arrive at something similar to what happened to the person in the final story. So although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, and viewer discretion is strongly advised. Wast Water is a beautiful 3-mile-long glacial lake located in England's majestic Lake District National Park. This is about 260 miles northwest of London. And although the lake isn't particularly deep by most standards, at about 260 feet deep, it's actually the deepest lake in the entire country. As a result, it's always been popular with amateur military and police divers and professional search and rescue divers as a place to train and explore the lake. In October of 1976, a group of divers who regularly visited the lake came across a large bundle resting on an underwater ledge adjacent to the deepest part of the lake. The oval-shaped object was approximately 3 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, but it was surprisingly heavy for its size. The divers had no idea what was inside, but the outside was wrapped with fabric and carpet and bound together with a rope and electrical tape. Afterward, they often removed this bundle from the ledge and swam with it to improve their stamina and to test whether they'd be able to haul an incapacitated diver to the surface in an emergency situation. Then, when they were done, they would always put it back where they found it. Surprisingly, they apparently didn't think this was odd or suspicious because locals often wrapped deceased pets in rugs and blankets, weighed them down with rocks or bricks, and then disposed of them in the lake. And in fact, the divers regularly came across packages like this over the years, although most of them were significantly smaller and lighter than the big bundle on the ledge. Several years later, in 1983, a 21-year-old French tourist vanished while hiking the lake, and she was a physically fit young woman who regularly hiked in the French Alps. She also didn't speak much English, but she had a knack for making friends and planned to complete a moderately difficult hike with the group she met that day. But somewhere along the line, she got separated from the group either intentionally or unintentionally. The other hikers initially assumed she just went off to explore on her own and that she'd catch up with them later, but they began to get seriously worried that afternoon when she failed to show up at the post-hike rendezvous point. Then when her parents in Paris hadn't heard from her 2 days later, they contacted the local authorities and reported her missing. Afterward, alpine search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, divers, and aircraft all participated in one of the largest searches in park history, but no sign of her was found in or around the lake. In late February of the following year, an amateur diver came across the large bundle in Wast Water that other divers had been using as a practice weight since October of 1976. But unlike the other divers, he immediately reported it to the police because he thought it might contain the body of the hiker. Police divers then retrieved it that afternoon, and it only took a few snips and a little unwrapping to determine that it did in fact contain human remains. Nobody knew who the poor woman inside was or how long she'd been in the lake, but it didn't look like she'd been dead for very long because there was almost no decomposition. Even her mascara was apparently in nearly pristine condition. However, what was immediately apparent was that it couldn't possibly be the tourist because the woman in the bundle was clearly middle-aged. The case then took another unexpected turn when investigators discovered that she was wearing a wedding ring, and upon closer inspection they found that it bore the inscription Margaret 15-11-63 Peter. This woman would come to be known as Margaret, and her background is a bit of a mystery. But we know that she married Peter Hogg on Friday, November 15th, 1963, and that their names and the date were inscribed on her wedding ring. Peter was 19 years older than Margaret, and at the time he was an airline pilot and she was a stewardess. Peter and Margaret worked for a number of airlines over the years, and they eventually had 2 children and settled into comfortable upper-middle-class lives. Unfortunately, their relationship was already struggling in 1973 when Margaret began having an affair with an American banker she met on a transatlantic flight. Peter apparently found out about it almost immediately because Margaret openly flaunted it. Afterward, he did his best to turn a blind eye to the infidelity for the sake of their children, but she apparently threw the affair in his face whenever she got the chance. It's not really clear what caused the initial rift between them or what kind of husband Peter was, but soon enough, the tension in the home was set to be unbearable. This was made slightly more bearable because they weren't always home together because they had busy schedules, but when they were, they argued constantly. And again, at some point, Margaret began regularly bringing up the affair just to get a rise out of Peter. This then often escalated until things even got physical. But even so, Margaret and Peter stayed married and continued living together for 3 more unimaginably long years. That was until the situation finally boiled over one evening in October of 1976 when she casually strolled through the front door after a week-long vacation in Dorset with her affair partner. And then, after that, Margaret was just out of his life and the lives of their children. Peter told friends and family that she ran off with another man, but he waited nearly a month before calling the police and reported her missing. Shortly thereafter, he met with a local solicitor to initiate divorce proceedings. The police did what they could to track Margaret down, but it's worth pointing out that there was also absolutely no evidence at the time to suggest that she was in danger or that a crime had been committed. As far as police knew, she ran off with another man, like Peter said. So, investigators had no choice but to put the case on the back burner, and by mid-1977, everyone assumed that Margaret was gone for good. By the time she was found, nearly 8 years had passed since her disappearance. The details of the discovery were then broadcast on a handful of local news programs, and shortly after, a number of Margaret's friends and family members came forward to confirm that the ring was hers. Later, marriage and dental records also confirmed that Margaret married Peter Hogg on November 15, 1963, and that she was the woman in the bundle. By then, investigators also knew about her affair and that her husband Peter reported her missing in November of 1976. They then surprised him by showing up at his home and telling him that Margaret's body had been found. He adamantly denied having to do with her disappearance or her death, but a subsequent search of the home revealed bloodstains under the carpet in the master bedroom, as well as a rope and cloth that were identical to what the killer used to bind the bundle. The 57-year-old was then arrested and charged with Margaret's murder on Sunday, March 4, 1984. He pleaded not guilty, and during his trial in London, his solicitor tried to portray him as a long-suffering family man who'd endured years of infidelity, torment, and provocation from his vicious, cold-hearted wife. Then when her affair partner took the stand, he told the court about their vacation in Dorset the week before her disappearance. He also said that as far as he was concerned, her abrupt return must have been the spark that set off the violent altercation that ultimately led to her death. And in light of the physical and circumstantial evidence against him, Peter eventually realized that his only hope was to confess and throw himself at the mercy of the court. He then began by telling the judge and jury about the argument he and Margaret got into as soon as he walked in the door that night. A few minutes later, he claimed that she did what she always did. She berated him, demeaned him, threw things at him, punched and scratched him, and kicked him in the groin. Then, when he couldn't bear it any longer, he punched her, grabbed her around the neck, and held on for far too long. Peter said that he came to his senses a few seconds later, but that Margaret fell to the floor when he released his grip. At that moment, he knew what he had done and that he had a very important decision to make. On one hand, he could turn himself in, risk spending the rest of his life in prison, and leave his 2 young children motherless and fatherless. Or he could dispose of her body, report her missing, deny knowing anything about her disappearance, and hope for the best. That night, he placed a dry cleaning bag over her body, bound her in the fetal position around a concrete block, wrapped her in fabric and an old carpet, and cinched the bundle together with rope and electrical cable. Then he loaded the bundle and an inflatable rubber dinghy into his trunk and set out on an overnight drive 270 miles to the north. Just before sunrise, he rode out into what he thought was the deepest part of the lake and pushed the bundle into the cold, dark water. Peter also told the jury that it was the longest day of his life and that he was so nervous that he almost fell out of the boat while disposing of Margaret's body. And in the end, he said he didn't commit murder because he had killed her in the heat of the moment without malice or forethought. And afterward, after an unexpectedly short deliberation, the jury apparently agreed. To the horror of Margaret's friends and family, they found Peter guilty of manslaughter instead of the far more serious charge of murder. When it was all said and done, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for manslaughter and another year for obstructing a coroner and committing perjury during the divorce proceedings that he initiated shortly after Margaret's death. Margaret's body probably would have disappeared forever if it hadn't come to rest on the narrow ledge adjacent to the deepest part of the lake. If it hadn't, it's unlikely that Peter ever would have been charged with her murder. And as for the missing Frenchwoman that helped solve the case, a 53-year-old hiker found her remains in a boulder field 1,000 feet above Wast Water in May of 1985. Marks and injuries found on her remains indicated that she was likely killed from a fall of great height. The discovery was the kind of thing that sticks with a person, the kind of sight that haunts a small town long after the headlines fade. It was April 13th, 1977, when Charlie and Mavis returned to their abandoned farmland about 8 miles west of Tofield, Alberta, Canada. They were actually scavenging, hoping to salvage a septic tank pump from the old property before buying a brand new one. It's unclear if they ever did find that pump, but what they did find was a foot protruding from the murky depths of the septic tank on the abandoned property, pale and bloated. And it was still attached to a leg that bobbed gently beneath the surface of the foul, murky water. What the couple initially assumed was some kind of grotesque prank quickly took a darker turn. They then wasted no time hurrying back to their vehicle and driving straight to the Tofield RCMP detachment, where 2 officers responded without hesitation. When the couple led the officers back to the septic tank, the scene was like something out of a horror movie. The old septic tank, roughly 6 feet or 1.8 meters deep, held more than just stagnant toilet water. Just like Charlie had told them, the officer saw the foot poking out from the water. They could tell that the body had been there for a while, as it was badly decomposed and wrapped haphazardly in a yellow bedsheet and bound tightly with nylon rope. Whoever it was, they were stuffed into the tank headfirst as if someone hoped to erase them from existence. The officers on hand also had no forensics tools or hazmat suits, so with an ice cream pail they found on the property, they spent the next hour taking turns scooping out the putrid water inch by inch until they could retrieve what was left of the man inside. This was a gruesome, laborious process that would stay with everyone involved. As word of the discovery got out, the press dubbed him Septic Tank Sam, a placeholder name for a man who had suffered one of the most brutal deaths Alberta had ever seen. He had no wallet, no IDs, there were no easy answers, just a body discarded in a rural septic tank waiting for someone to stumble on it. And while much was unclear in the earliest stages of the investigation, police knew right away that this wasn't some random act of violence. Whoever killed the man known as Septic Tank Sam had gone to great lengths to conceal the body and even greater lengths to inflict suffering. The first thing detectives focused on was what little the body could tell them. The victim was dressed in workman's clothing, a blue Levi's snap-button shirt, a gray t-shirt, blue jeans, and imitation wallaby shoes. Obviously, this wasn't really all that distinctive. There was also no name stitched onto the collar or personal effects tucked into his pockets, just plain, rugged clothing common among laborers, farmhands, and construction workers. The killer or killers, however, had made a critical misstep. The perpetrator had covered the body in something known as quicklime before dumping it. This backfired though. Instead of dissolving the body, the chemical, when combined with the moisture in the tank, almost preserved him, locking the evidence in time. So what the killer had hoped would vanish was now the investigators' most valuable asset. And this was good because the septic tank itself gave up no clues. There were no shell casings or weapons at the scene. Nothing at all also pointed to where the man had been killed, and along with the decomposition of the body, this suggested that he hadn't died there. The tank, it seems, was just a dump site. Police then began working through possible scenarios, and the sheer brutality of the incident pointed to a personal motive like revenge, jealousy, or maybe retribution for a perceived slight. It was clear that this wasn't random, and this was then confirmed by the autopsy. It was clear Septic Tank Sam had gone through a prolonged and deeply disturbing ordeal. The medical examiner in Edmonton first began piecing together what little remained of the decomposed body. At first, even identifying the victim's race was a challenge. The examiner initially classified the man as Caucasian, which would later turn out to be a huge mistake that hampered the investigation early on. The official cause of death was then ruled as gunshot wounds. There were at least 2 shots fired from a .32 caliber semi-automatic weapon striking the head and chest, but those weren't the injuries that stayed with investigators. What stood out much more was the deliberate, methodical damage inflicted before the final shots were fired. The man had been tied up, attacked, and there were burns on his body. These were determined to have come from both cigarettes and a small butane torch. And that's not even the worst of it. Apparently, damage was so severe to some areas that it took months to confirm the body was in fact male. The exact tools were never identified as there was too much damage and decomposition, but farm shears were floated as a likely possibility. Then, after he was finally given mercy, the man was shoved headfirst into the septic tank, doused with quicklime, and left there. But even despite all of this, the medical examiner would still be able to learn more about him. Sam had a full set of intact teeth, and some even showed signs of recent dental work. He was also of medium build with dark hair, and judging by his workman's clothing, likely employed in some kind of manual labor. Investigators then floated the idea that Sam might have been a transient or migrant worker passing through Alberta, someone who wouldn't have been missed right away. And Tofield, while small, sat close enough to Edmonton that a drifter or day laborer could have easily passed through unnoticed. But with no name, no leads, and a crime scene that was clearly personal, investigators knew solving it hinged on figuring out who he really was. What followed was more than 4 decades of frustration. The first big move, though, came 2 years after the body was found. In 1979, the remains were exhumed from their unmarked grave in an Edmonton cemetery and flown to Oklahoma. There, 2 of the top forensics experts in North America got to work. Their specialty was rebuilding faces from skulls, and using 3D facial reconstruction, they created a model of Sam's face. And more importantly, for the first time made an educated guess at who he might have been, not by name, but by background. Based on bone structure and measurements, they believe the man was indigenous and around 35 years old, contrary to the RCMP report. Unfortunately though, the reconstruction didn't spark any new leads. So, Sam was laid back to rest as a man without an identity. After that, it would be another 2 decades in the year 2000 before the body was exhumed again. This time, forensic artist Cyril Chan from the Chief Medical Examiner's office tried to rebuild Sam's face, this time using clay. Using the original skull and teeth, Cyril spent weeks marking facial tissue depths with pins and molding brown clay, layering makeshift flesh over bone. He believed this version was more accurate than the 1979 model, but it didn't matter. His reconstruction then made the rounds, landing on posters, news broadcasts, and cold case websites, yet still no one recognized Septic Tank Sam. And through it all, Tofield remained uneasy, not just because of what had happened, but because of the brutality of it. Some farmers reportedly checked their own septic tanks, afraid they might find another Sam. Business owners also wondered if they'd unknowingly served coffee to a killer, and of course, rumors circulated. There was speculation that the murder had been revenge, a punishment for infidelity, or even retribution for some crime, but still not a single name. And then, in 2018, everything changed, not just for Sam, but for cold cases everywhere. That year, California investigators cracked open one of America's most infamous unsolved cases. They had identified the Golden State Killer through an emerging tool known as forensic genealogy. This is where, by uploading crime scene DNA to public genetic databases, investigators can build family trees and trace suspects from bloodlines. Inspired by the success in California in 2019, Alberta RCMP's Missing Persons Unit pulled his old degraded DNA sample and tried matching it in Canada's new National DNA Database. It was a long shot, and in a surprise to absolutely no one involved in the case, it failed. But despite this first failure in 2020, detectives turned to Othram Inc., a private DNA lab in Texas known for working miracles with impossible samples. Their technicians then got to work pushing the limits of the technology until they created a genetic profile. From that, police finally built a family tree, uploading the data into public databases and slowly working outward, hunting for living relatives who might connect back to Sam. By October 2020, more than 40 years after the body was discovered, they finally had a name. Septic Tank Sam was known as Gordon or Gordy Sanderson. He was a 26-year-old Indigenous man from Manitoba who had disappeared sometime in the mid-1970s. The breakthrough then came full circle when the RCMP reached out to Gordy's surviving relatives, confirming the match through his older sister. On June 29, 2021, nearly 44 years after his death, the Alberta RCMP held a virtual press conference and announced Gordy's name for the first time publicly. What made the case difficult to swallow beyond what Gordy had went through was that Gordy's family had tried to report him missing, but the dots were never connected. No one thought to link an Indigenous man to the septic tank body because investigators spent years assuming he was white. With his identity finally known, though, the case was transformed. For the first time since 1977, it wasn't about identifying the victim, it was about hunting perpetrators, and maybe more than one. Tragically, though, this investigation continues to this day as police work to determine who was responsible for Gordy's death. In the meantime, though, as work continues, Gordy's story can finally be told. He was born on October 22, 1950 in Manitoba, and sadly, like so many Indigenous children of his generation, his life was shaped and shattered by something called the 60s Scoop. This was a policy that tore thousands of Aboriginal children from their families between the 1960s and 1980s. They were then placed into foster care homes or adopted out to white middle-class families. Gordy was 9 years old when he was taken, and like so many others afterward, he grew up alienated, isolated, and struggling. By the 1970s, he was living in Edmonton, bouncing from place to place, tangled up in addiction problems, and scraping by the best he could. Police also knew his name, but only because of minor run-ins. The last anyone in his family heard, Gordy was planning to visit his younger brother in Calgary. It was supposed to be a simple trip and a chance to reconnect, but somewhere along the way, Gordy vanished. His sister then went on to try to find him, and she reported him missing after years of wondering and worrying. But again, the initial misclassification of the body meant that even if someone was asking the right questions about Gordy, the answers wouldn't have led back to him and Sam being one and the same. And so when the police finally identified him in 2021, the revelation was bittersweet. For Gordy's family, there was relief in knowing what happened, but there was also rage and heartbreak. Decades were lost, and justice had been delayed, even to this day. The reality was that Gordy had spent 44 years known only by a nickname born from a place he was dumped, and it was sickening. Gordy wasn't just Septic Tank Sam. He was a brother, a son, and a victim of a system that had failed him. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.